Hi, everybody. I'm Mrs. Brown, and today we're going to be diving into Chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's a story full of lies, mystery, and obsession. And it's also one of the most beloved American literature classics. This story is going to be told by our unreliable narrator named Nick Carraway, who is telling the story after everything has already happened. He's reflecting on his time after the fact. So, except for like the first part of the exposition, the entire book is going to be a flashback. Now, there's going to be three different levels of wealth and privilege in this story. Old money, which is where a family's had a significant amount of money in their family for at least 3 generations. New money, which is where a person has come from little to no money and is now wealthy. So think of like celebrities who have made it from like nothing. And no money, which sadly is just what it sounds like. The person has little to no money and it's difficult to make ends meet. Remember that the first part of the story is the exposition. So we're going to learn about who our main characters are, some hints about their personalities, and the setting. Let's go ahead and dive on in.
Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores.
Here we have where Nick's father told him not to judge people until he understands where they've come from. And I mean, he's already led an easy life because he's going to be old money. Remember, that's where it's been that there's a lot of money in their family for at least 3 generations. But Nick misunderstands this and then thinks that his father says that Nick should never judge anybody ever. No, my man, that's not what it says. That's not what it says.
The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon.
What? Nick learns about people's secrets by pretending to be asleep, pretending to do something else, or making hurtful jokes when people are about to spill their secrets. Nick, this doesn't paint it in the best light, man.
For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And, after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit.
Now, something happened within Nick's life in order to make him finally judge others. Well, good, finally. But, you feel bad if like, well, what happened in order to make you go and judge others? That's what this book is for. And so this is going to be the story that shows why he finally started to judge.
Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby. What foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men.
This entire story is going to be a flashback, which is the narrator telling the story in hindsight. Nick is going to be an omniscient narrator, which means that he knows what's going on at all times. Based upon what he said on the first page, though, can his narration be trusted? Probably not, because, he's in this story and he's going to try to go and make himself look better. Happens. Now, this is probably one of the most important passages in the entirety of Gatsby because it gives so many clues and hints about what's going to happen in the book. Gatsby is going to be an important character because Nick names the book after him. So, yeah, it's kind of a given. But then look at this quote. Only Gatsby was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an affected scorn. So he doesn't like Gatsby, but something happened to make him accept him. But what happens to Gatsby? Look at those context clues. It says, Gatsby turned out all right, quote unquote, at the end. Or, quote unquote, it is what preyed on Gatsby. So Gatsby is going to be killed at the end of this book. Oh no. So now, instead of it just being like, oh, what a story, this is great. No, now it's become a mystery. And who is going to be the one who murders Gatsby? This isn't a love story, guys. If you've heard that this is a love story, that's a lie. It's a murder story.
My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent to substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently, I thought, in the spring of '22.
If we didn't really know where Nick's family is from, he is old money. And it says that there when it says, my family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. So that means he's old money. He's right at that cusp with that 3rd generation. Then it says, I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter century after my father. So what's the big college that's in New Haven? No, nothing too big, just Yale. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. So it sounds like it's become a family tradition to go and send the Carraway sons to Yale since his father also went there. But Nick was in World War I, so he's also a soldier. After his time in the military, he came out east in 1922 to become a bondsman. If you, again, weren't 100% just sold on the fact that Nick is old money, this part solidifies it here. It would make more financial sense to live in the city that he was working in, but he decided to go and commute. Why? Because he has the money to do so. He's going to go and originally have a roommate, but then at the last minute it didn't work out, and instead of being like, oh, I can't afford it, nope. Instead, Nick's dad, is going to go and pay for everything for Nick for an entire year. Must be nice. So he doesn't have to go and worry about that. So even though the roommate situation fell through, not a big deal.
The practical thing was to find rooms in the city. But it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove.
This part is so weird. So Nick does not seem all that reliable here either. Like his dog ran away and he has a housekeeper. It's just kind of weird.
It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again, with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold, like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man.
I'm sorry, Nick seems like a bit of a snob right here. I was rather literary in college. It's like, calm down, sir. He just seems to be a little bit of a snob and he's constantly looking for approval in life. So remember that as well. This is going to be a big hint. Chapter 1 is always, like whenever you go and meet new characters, there's always going to be all these super tiny, tiny hints that go and like create who the character are.
This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size.
Okay, so this part actually does exist. It's not called East Egg, West Egg. Instead, it's called Great Neck and Manhasset Neck. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not 100% sure. And interestingly enough, our author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, used to party here. So he's drawing on his own life. Side note, the character of Gatsby is actually based upon F. Scott Fitzgerald himself, and the character of Daisy is based upon his wife, Zelda.
I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them.
West Egg symbolizes new money.
My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of the same Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximities of millionaires, all for $80 a month.
So this Hotel de Ville in Normandy, that actually exists. And there was a real life Gatsby house. And so it's this like super ornate, over the top, and it's trying to look like old money, but it's failing.
Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago.
Across the water is where Old Money lives, and Tom and Daisy Buchanan live there. Daisy is Nick's second cousin once removed, and Tom went to Yale with Nick. So both of these people are definitely old money. Now, you're going to go, and Nick's already old money, but you're going to go and see like the little bit of a difference of where they're like uber rich there.
Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way, one of those men who reach such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterward savors of anticlimax.
Watch how Tom is described in this chapter. So far, he's a former football player, or football star, excuse me, who peaked in college. I'm always reminded of like Al Bundy from Married with Children with that. I don't know why, but I am.
His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there, unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game.
Next clue. Tom and Daisy move a lot, and it looks like he's always searching for the next big thing.
And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run, the front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch.
Georgian colonial is actually a type of house structure. I don't know if that's the right word. And it's quite elaborate. And this one screams, I've got money.
He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body.
Check out the words that are used to describe Tom. Sturdy, straw-haired, so that means he's blonde. He's 30. He has a hard mouth and supercilious manner, which means he thinks he's better than everyone else. Oh yeah, he's just a guy I want to be friends with. And then it says that he has like this enormous power of that body that filled the boots and strained the top lacing, a great pack of muscle, and that he has a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. What picture does this paint of this character? I mean, like, he is not somebody that I want to go and hang out with and be friends with. And for some reason, I always think of like the blonde version of Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. I don't know why, but I just do. I just get that like mental image.
His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts.
His voice is a jerk, fractiousness and paternal contempt. So he thinks that he's above everybody else and he doesn't have to follow the rules. Those are for other people to follow, not for him.
Now don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say. just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside."
He's such a jerk. I've got a nice place here. Like, he's just so abrupt, and he doesn't even attempt to go and make polite conversation. He's just instead just all about himself.
We walked through a high hallway into a bright rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight round the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom, as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor.
Oh, what imagery. So the room is alive until Tom comes in and shuts the windows, and it kills all movement in the room. So just as a reminder, I know I've talked about this a couple times, but remember that the exposition's where the author is telling the readers all about the setting and the characters, but there's also all of these hidden context clues in there. And I mean, think about it. What could Fitzgerald be saying about Tom? The room was alive, and then Tom came in and shut the windows and killed all movement.
The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came forward into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness." She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming.
We finally get to meet the infamous Daisy Buchanan. She's dressed in white, as is her friend, and she tries to get up but doesn't, and then gives a quote-unquote absurd, charming little laugh and says that she's paralyzed with happiness. Seriously? Like, girl, just get up. Look at how Daisy speaks. It's to go and make people lean towards her, which makes people think that they're close to her. So it gives that mental image of that they are super close to one another.
At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me, almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was a kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour.
Next page, and it's talking about Daisy's voice yet again. People enjoy listening to her voice and watching her facial expressions. She is very charismatic and it draws people in, especially men.
I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow. Then she added irreverently, You ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's...
Huh. Well, that one came out of nowhere. Tom and Daisy are parents. Did not see that one coming. Now, depending upon which book you read, sometimes the baby's 2, sometimes 3. I don't know why, but there is a difference and I wanted to point that out. Interestingly, Fitzgerald writes that Daisy irreverently adds that Nick should meet her toddler daughter. Irreverent means a lack of respect for people or something that should be taken seriously. So she's just all like, oh yeah, you should meet my kid. Like, does that mean that she's not all that concerned with her daughter? I mean, or is it Nick? I don't know. Also, Daisy really enjoys the thought of people missing her and thinks that she can just make things all better for them by gracing them with her presence. She's kind of vapid. She's just all about herself. She and Tom are very well suited.
Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What you doing, Nick? I'm a bondman. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, Absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are. He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me.
Side note here. Remember that this book takes place in the 1920s, which is during Prohibition, which would make alcoholic beverages illegal. So how does Tom get the booze? This also reiterates that Tom and Daisy think that they're above the law and don't have to follow the rules.
I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. You live in West Egg? She remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby?
The friend. So her full name is Jordan Baker, just as a heads up for you. And she is not impressed with Nick living in like the New Money area of West Egg. And she doesn't even try to hide it. She's just all like, oh, really, you live there? Sorry to hear that. And then she says that Nick must know Gatsby. And look at Daisy's interesting phrasing here. What Gatsby, not who's Gatsby. So this is kind of implying that she's met somebody named Gatsby before in her life. Remember, you guys, at the end of this book, Gatsby is going to die. We now have a connection that Daisy and Gatsby know each other in some way, shape, or form. And who's Daisy married to? A very over-the-top, self-absorbed jerk who has a cruel body.
Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day in the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it."
You might not know this, or not off the top of your head. The longest day of the year is June 20th. So that means that the story really starts at the beginning of June. Now, seasons are going to be really, really, really important in this book. So spring represents like birth or a new beginning. Summer represents adulthood and things heating up. And fall is going to represent things slowing down, old age. And winter traditionally represents death. So since Nick said that the story really begins when he went to Tom and Daisy's house and it's summer, this means that this is the beginning of something heating up. So it's the beginning of summer, and remember that we know that Gatsby's going to die. So if we look at the seasons, do we know which season he's going to die?
"We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What do we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she complained. "I heard it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a—" "I hate that word hulking," objected Tom crossly. "Even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy.
It doesn't matter which book you read, always, always, always pay attention to the first chapter in a book because it gives so many clues as to what's going to happen later on in the novel. So far, let's recap. We know that Gatsby's going to die. Someone's going to prey on him, meaning going to hunt him down. We have things heating up, and now we have where Daisy is injured. Tom has gone and bruised Daisy, although it was accidentally. But foreshadowing and characterization, anyone? I mean, that's huge. And look at how Tom reacts to Daisy calling him hulking. Not very nicely. It seems as if they don't have that great of a marriage, and they intentionally and inadvertently hurt each other physically as well as verbally.
Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening, too, would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Godard?" "Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." "Tom is getting very profound," said Daisy, with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word we—" "Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out or these other races will have control of things."
Oh, wow. Wow. So Tom is a racist, and he's parading around claiming that it's quote unquote scientific, which is complete garbage.
"We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and you are, and... After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore.
Man, Tom just has like a shovel and he just keeps on digging. This part, even though it's kind of difficult to read it gives us a big clue as to what each of the characters look like. So we already knew from Nick's original description that Tom was blonde, but it appears as if Nick and Jordan are also blondes based upon him saying, we're Nordics, I am, and you are, and you are. But look, he hesitates on Daisy. And then before he begrudgingly includes her. So it generally mean that she would probably doesn't have blonde hair. Like maybe it's a light brown or like a dark blonde. I don't really know. So interestingly, Daisy's always being cast as blonde, and then the rest of them usually has always been cast with like dark hair. So it's just kind of interesting.
When, almost immediately, the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk.
Daisy's face and voice are drawing Nick in over a pretty ridiculous story. Remember that Nick is Daisy's cousin and she's married, and yet there's something about her that draws people in. She just has that natural charisma, and she knows it and uses it. So can we really trust Daisy either?
The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house.
It is obvious Daisy is not happy with Tom talking on the phone. And at first she's all like trying to play it off, but then she just like abruptly leaves. I mean, like, I wonder if there's trouble in paradise.
Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said shh in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor, I said. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy, with tense gaiety.
Ooh, it's getting good. Tom and Daisy are arguing about him being on the phone, and then we learn that it's Tom's mistress who's been calling during dinner, and Daisy is not happy. Now, I'm not excusing it, But in this time period, it was actually expected for men from old money to have mistresses, and the wives were just really expected to put up with it. I mean, obviously, Daisy is not one to go and put up with it. And, like, look at her personality. She is a person who likes to be in the center of attention at all time, and so does Tom. So that's kind of like a personality clash there, too. But for her to not be in the center of attention at all times, a mistress would mean that she is like sharing the spotlight, and she's not all about that life. And but Daisy wants to go and make it seem like as if everything is perfectly fine in their world, and then she lies as they come on back out. Oh, it couldn't be helped. Sure, girl. We know. We know.
She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and continued, I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or White Star line. He's singing away, her voice sang. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me. If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into the air.
Oh my goodness, the mistress is calling again. She does not know when to quit. So, does this indicate that the mistress is unwilling to give up? Yeah. Does this mean that trouble's a brewing? Yeah.
Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hardy skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of mind. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while, trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands, as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said suddenly. Even if we were cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything. Evidently she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter.
They're out walking and Daisy's opening up, although it seems kind of self-centered. I mean, she's mad at Nick that he didn't come to her wedding. He was off fighting in a war, a world war, Daisy. I think he was busy. So then she says that she's had a rough time and that it's made her very cynical about life, but then she just like leaves it there. Why? Probably so that way Nick's like, oh, please tell me more.
I suppose she talks and eats and everything. Oh, yes, she looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl. And I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool.
Oh, why does Daisy want her daughter to be a beautiful fool? I mean, is Daisy a fool? No, I mean, she's actually really, really smart. I mean, look back at all the stuff that she's been talking about. She's actually very intelligent, but she wants her daughter to be happy in life. And so she hopes that her daughter will be beautiful and that she hopes that her daughter will also be a fool, meaning that she's too dumb and therefore she won't be disappointed by a future husband. That's just tragic right there. Oh my gosh.
You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know.
So even though Daisy was making fun of Tom with his racist views earlier, it seems kind of like that Daisy believes some of that too, based upon her saying the most advanced people. Okay. Ugh. I don't know. She definitely thinks that she's better than others. Like, she doesn't come across as terrible as Tom, but there's definitely those undertones. And then it just reminds me, remember, F. Scott Fitzgerald based the character of Gatsby upon himself, and he based the character of Daisy on his wife. F. Scott Fitzgerald, how was your marriage with Zelda? Hmm.
I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged.
Whoa, this is huge. It indicates that we as readers cannot trust anything that Tom and Daisy say. Everything they do is a trick to control others, and even though they fight, it's like Tom and Daisy as endgame because they're two sides of the same coin, and that is going to be extremely important for the rest of this book.
Inside, the Crimson Room bloomed with light. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a fluttering of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her, too, a critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago.
Ah, so Jordan is a famous golfer, and Nick recalls that he's heard quote unquote a critical unpleasant story about her. And this also puts her in the same league as Tom and Daisy. So they're just, I don't know, they're kind of rotten.
Good night, she said softly. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up. I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, confirmed Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together. You know, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way.
Okay, so a small history fact. Remember that women did not get the right to vote until 1920, and this book is set in 1922. Most people, men back then, viewed women as needing to be taken care of and also not equal to men.
Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white...
I love this part. So even though, and this goes and proves that Daisy is, actually super smart, even though she's talking about Jordan, she's really referring to Tom and how it would be a good influence on him to go and stay home. So she's just, eyeballing him, just being like, yeah, staying home would be really good. And then we also learned that Daisy and Jordan grew up together in Louisville, Kentucky.
Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west." "That's right," corroborated Tom kindly. "We heard that you were engaged." "It's a libel. I'm too poor." "But we heard it," insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. "We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true." Of course I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage.
Interesting. So we find out that Nick was the subject of rumors and that people believed he was engaged, but it appears that that person was a friend. So, side note, many readers and some literary critics argue that this is Fitzgerald's obscure way of referencing that Nick is gay.
Their interests rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms, but apparently there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book.
I just love this. This is like a total zinger. I'm just like, as far as Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising that he had been depressed by a book.
Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages, where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while in an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens.
And now, at the close of Chapter 1, we meet the final important main character, Mr. Gatsby.
I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward, and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again, in the unquiet darkness.
Why was Gatsby standing outside by himself? Why is he stretching his trembling hands towards something across the water? Who's the only ones that we know that happen to live across the water? How could that be connected? I don't know. Remember that Daisy said, "What Gatsby?" rather than "Who's Gatsby?" And now we have Gatsby coming on out in the dark and tremblingly reaching across, or reaching out, not across. He doesn't have, like, he's not Stretch Armstrong or anything. That'd be kind of cool, though. So could there be a connection? Of course there is. So let's read on to find out what that connection is.